May 1944. The air smelled of wet soil and tar paper as hundreds of weary German prisoners shuffled off a troop train in the American Midwest. Their boots scraped gravel, chains clinked faintly, and in their minds one thought circled: this will be brutal. The Reich had told them America was barbaric. Many whispered that no German ever returned alive from Allied hands, yet the scene before them clashed violently with their fears. Instead of cages or whipping posts, they saw neat rows of wooden barracks, whitewashed fences, and a guarded compound that looked more like a tidy farm than a punishment ground. Barbed wire gleamed in the sun, but behind it they smelled something deeply unsettling: warm bread, a hint of frying oil, maybe even sugar. NNFOR men who had survived the Eastern Front, this was unthinkable. Their rations had been moldy rye crusts, turnip soup thin as water, and sometimes horse meat, if they were lucky. In the last months, many had marched half-starved, bellies gnawing. Yet here, in the very heart of enemy territory, the aroma of food seemed to taunt them. A few prisoners looked at one another in disbelief. Are we dreaming? NNTHEUS had built dozens of these camps. By 1945, official records list more than 370,000 German POWs held in the United States, spread across states like Texas, Iowa, and Georgia. Most of these men expected iron bars and cruelty. What they saw instead was order, efficiency, and, most shocking of all, comforts. An American guard barked orders, but not with the venom they anticipated. "Line up, keep moving," he said, almost flatly, almost routine. Some Germans stiffened, bracing for kicks or rifle butts. None came. Instead, guards guided them into registration rooms, handed out blankets, and pointed to barracks with bunk beds and stoves. In one diary, later uncovered, a captured sergeant wrote, "It smelled like a bakery, not a prison." That smell clung to them stronger than the fear of barbed wire. It triggered confusion, suspicion, even anger. How could an enemy, their enemy, offer a life immediately better than the collapsing Reich they had fought for? NNTHE prisoners tried to shake it off, convincing themselves it was a trick. But that smell of frying oil drifted closer each hour, until soon the mystery would be solved at the camp's food line. The mystery grew stronger that first evening. From the mess hall kitchens, steam hissed out of metal vents, drifting across the compound. German POWs stood behind barbed wire, noses tilted upward, eyes narrowing. It wasn't cabbage or boiled potatoes. It was sweet, heavy, intoxicating, fried dough meeting hot oil, and one man muttered in disbelief, "Impossible. There is sugar in this." For months, they had gone without even a grain. In Germany, by spring 1944, sugar was rationed to bare crumbs, often replaced with saccharin or beet syrup. But here, in captivity, the smell of real sweetness filled the air like a cruel joke. Through the windows they caught glimpses: American cooks in white aprons dusting pans, trays pulled from ovens, buckets of flour stacked high. It looked less like a prison kitchen and more like a bakery. Some prisoners closed their eyes, almost dizzy. Others clenched fists. The fear was fading, replaced by something stranger: hunger mixing with humiliation. Later reports from Red Cross inspectors confirmed what these men first sensed. Millions of pastries were prepared and distributed to POW camps across the U.S. American food supply chains had become so massive that even prisoners of war received luxuries unimaginable back home. In fact, American farmers produced record harvests in 1943 and 1944, enough to feed civilians, troops, and even their captives. A guard passing the fence caught one man staring too long. Instead of snapping, he smirked. "Don't worry, Kraut," he said, "you'll taste it soon enough." The words were half tease, half kindness, but to German ears it sounded surreal. Food, sweet food. From the enemy? One prisoner whispered, "Not even our frontline soldiers eat like this." And it was true. Letters smuggled from Germany told of families boiling nettles for soup, of soldiers scraping tins for calories. Here, the enemy was drowning them in temptation before a single bite had touched their lips. NNTHAT night. Inside the barracks, the smells still clung to their uniforms. Some dreamed of home bakeries before the war, of mothers dusting sugar over strudel. Others stared into the dark, unsettled. If this was captivity, what else would follow? NNTHE next morning, the answer came. A line formed by the kitchen. Guards stood with trays in hand, and the unthinkable happened. The first donuts were given to German POWs. The morning sun struck the wire as prisoners lined up. Stomachs knotted in a mix of hunger and disbelief. The smell that had haunted them all night was now reality. Trays of round pastries, steam curling off their golden crusts, being carried casually by American guards. No speeches, no ceremony, just food. NNTHE guards distributed them almost indifferently, like it was the most normal thing in the world. One GI balanced a tray with 20 donuts, passing them out one by one. His expression was flat, businesslike. For the Germans watching, every motion felt surreal. Captivity had always meant less. Less food, less freedom, less dignity. But here, the very first meal they would remember most wasn't bread or soup. It was donuts. A silence spread when the first POW bit into one. Soft dough gave way under teeth, warm and sweet against a tongue that had forgotten sugar existed. For a second he froze, then chewed slowly, eyes darting, as if afraid the taste itself was forbidden. Around him, men followed. Each bite was like striking a match inside a starved mind. Reports later confirmed staggering numbers. Up to 7 million donuts were shared with German POWs in camps across the U.S. during the war. They weren't ration scraps, they weren't propaganda stunts. They were simply excess, the byproduct of America's industrial abundance. In a nation that produced 6.7 billion pounds of sugar in 1944 alone, giving donuts to the enemy barely made a dent. NNBUT to the prisoners, it was an earthquake. Many hadn't seen real sugar since 1942. In Germany, jam was thinned to water, coffee replaced with roasted acorns, and sweet shops had long since closed. Here, the enemy handed over what felt like treasure, without hesitation. One POW muttered, almost angrily, "Our own army never gave us this." Another wrote in his notebook later, "We expected chains. We received donuts." It was both humiliating and comforting, a mix impossible to reconcile. NNTHE guards, barely paying attention, moved down the line. For them, it was routine. For the Germans, it was a shattering of expectation. Every bite carried a bitter question. If America could waste sweetness on its prisoners, what else could they waste on the war? And that thought shifted from taste to calculation. The industrial mystery loomed. How could America produce so many donuts in the middle of a global war? The sweetness still lingered on their tongues when the real shock arrived. Trucks rattled up to the camp gates, canvas flapping in the wind. POWs watched as American soldiers unloaded sack after sack, flour, sugar, cooking oil. The piles grew higher than a man's shoulders. For the Germans behind the wire, it felt like a supply dump for an entire division. Yet it was just the weekly delivery for prisoners. In Germany, food convoys had become targets, ration lines stretched for hours, and bread was padded with sawdust fillers. But here in the heart of America, trucks seemed endless, tires crunching on gravel, engines idling, soldiers laughing as they moved supplies without urgency. One prisoner whispered bitterly, "This is not just food. This is power." He was right. America's industrial machine had become a weapon in itself. Reports show that in 1944, the United States produced 6.7 billion pounds of sugar, 16 million tons of flour, and enough cooking oil to drown the needs of every POW camp many times over. Feeding enemy soldiers with donuts didn't weaken the war effort. It hardly registered, and NFOR the POWs, this abundance gnawed at their morale. The Reich had drilled into them the idea of sacrifice, of hunger as patriotism. But here, in captivity, they saw an enemy so wealthy in resources that even prisoners of war ate better than German civilians or frontline troops. The message was wordless, but deafening. America could fight a war and still live in comfort. Inside the mess hall, the scene was surreal. POWs sat with enamel mugs of milk, donuts on tin plates, while outside, guards leaned casually on rifles, chewing the same food. It wasn't equality. There was still wire, still orders, but the gulf of treatment between what they expected and what they received was staggering. One diary entry captured the disbelief. "They feed us like guests, not enemies. Our factories burn, but their ovens bake." Each tray of pastries was more than food. It was a reminder that the war's outcome was already tilted by production numbers the Germans could never hope to match. NTHE prisoners chewed slowly, trying to reconcile the taste with the terror of realization. If America could spare this much sweetness for its captives, what did it mean for the men still fighting at the front? NNTHAT question turned captivity into something deeper, a psychological collapse built not on violence, but on donuts. By the second week, the contradiction could no longer be ignored. German POWs sat at long wooden tables, biting into donuts, sipping coffee with real sugar, even receiving cartons of American cigarettes. The guards passed them out with bored efficiency, while the prisoners struggled to hide their astonishment. For many, it was the first time in years they felt full. Letters from home painted a darker picture. Civilians in Germany were scraping by on watery soups and ersatz bread. Frontline soldiers wrote of rations shrinking to less than 1,000 calories a day by early 1945, barely enough to fight, let alone march. Yet here, behind barbed wire, the enemy prisoners were gaining weight. Red Cross reports documented it bluntly. Many POWs repatriated to Germany healthier than when captured. NNTHE irony cut deep. A captured corporal confided to another, "We were kings in America, while our brothers starved at home." It wasn't bragging. It was disbelief tinged with guilt. Their captors gave them luxuries their own officers had denied. NNTHE guards never made speeches about it. They simply treated donuts as routine, just another part of daily life. For Americans, coffee with sugar, pastries, and milk were ordinary comforts. For Germans, such items had become mythical. The contrast hammered at their pride. One diary entry, smuggled back years later, described the humiliation clearly. "Our Führer preached sacrifice, yet here the enemy wastes abundance, even on prisoners." What does that say about our cause? It was not just calories. It was culture shock. Americans joked while handing out cigarettes, laughing at baseball scores, tossing extra pastries to thin young captives. No propaganda poster could counteract the living proof inside those camps. The Reich demanded loyalty through hunger. The enemy bought compliance with kindness. NNTHE POWs began to realize that their image of America as weak, decadent, or collapsing under war was a lie. If the nation could feed donuts to its prisoners, what could it provide to its armies in Europe, to fleets in the Pacific? The question turned every bite into a reminder of defeat. And yet, strangely, those same donuts also softened resistance. Guards found men more cooperative, less defiant. Sweetness didn't just break pride. It reshaped loyalties. Slowly, the donut was no longer just food. It became a symbol. NNTHAT symbol carried more weight than rifles, and soon the prisoners would see it everywhere, in laughter, in culture, in the strange normality of American life. By midsummer 1944, the donut was no longer just food. It had become a message. Each bite carried layers of meaning that the Germans couldn't shake. On one side of the wire, American guards leaned casually, laughing, sipping coffee, eating the same pastries without ceremony. On the other side, prisoners sat silent, chewing slowly, staring at the same circles of fried dough as if they were coded signals. NNFOR, many POWs, the donut came to embody what America itself represented: abundance, informality, and an almost arrogant confidence. The gesture wasn't about kindness alone. It was about demonstrating that victory was already paid for by endless production. When the guards slid trays across, they weren't just feeding bodies. They were feeding an image of an unstoppable machine. History had already linked the donut to American identity. During World War I, Salvation Army donut girls had become icons of U.S. troops, frying pastries in tin helmets and passing them to doughboys on the front. That tradition resurfaced in World War II, amplified by the Red Cross and the U.S. military's logistics network. To the German POWs, it seemed like a cultural weapon, sweetness wrapped in defiance. One prisoner admitted quietly to another, "This sweetness is more terrifying than their tanks." It wasn't exaggeration. Tanks could be fought, hunger could be endured. But this abundance, this effortless luxury in the middle of war, shattered their framework of belief. And reports from camp inspections note how POWs began to equate donuts with the surreal contradictions of captivity. They were enemies, yet treated as consumers. They were defeated, yet eating better than some victorious allies. And the Americans never highlighted it. No speeches, no banners, just casual servings of fried dough that spoke louder than propaganda. Some men resisted the meaning, turning inward, muttering about weakness. Others surrendered in spirit, beginning to admire the casual generosity. In both cases, the effect was the same. The donut had transformed from pastry to symbol. It was proof that Germany could not match the enemy's scale or spirit. In weeks past, the pastry became shorthand. A guard holding up a tray would joke, "Peace offering," and the prisoners would smirk nervously. Laughter replaced silence, but under it lay the same haunting realization: this was a war Germany could not win. And from symbolism grew something deeper: confusion, disorientation, and the unsettling kindness of those they had been taught to hate. The donut had broken the ice, but it also fractured the logic drilled into the prisoners. They had been told to expect fists, starvation, and humiliation. Instead, they received sugar, milk, and jokes from the very men guarding them. Fear hadn't disappeared. It had twisted into something harder to understand: confusion. On a hot afternoon in late July 1944, the camp kitchen rolled out another tray. A young American guard grinned as he slid donuts toward a thin German private and muttered, "Eat up, you'll get fat before going home." The tone was half teasing, half friendly. The prisoner forced a smile, but inside he was reeling. This wasn't how enemies behaved. German diaries later recovered from POWs reveal the same shock. "We were treated as if the war did not exist," one wrote. That was the dissonance. Inside the wire, food was plentiful. Cigarettes were passed out like candy, and guards chatted about baseball scores. Outside, Europe was burning. Cities flattened. Families rationed to crumbs. NNTHE statistics make the contrast brutal. In late 1944, German civilians survived on roughly 1,200 calories per day, while U.S. camp menus often reached 200 calories per prisoner. American Red Cross inspections documented men actually gaining weight in captivity. For soldiers trained to believe captivity meant slow death, the numbers didn't just surprise, they destabilized. One POW whispered, "They mock us with generosity." Another muttered that the Americans were softening them on purpose. But the truth was simpler. Donuts were routine to Americans, not strategy. The very casualness of it hit harder than propaganda could. NNTHE guards rarely even noticed the effect. For them, passing food was mechanical. For the Germans, every bite deepened the confusion. Were they prisoners or reluctant guests? Were they humiliated or strangely comforted? This contradiction bred silence at night. Some lay awake, tasting sugar on their tongues, thinking of hungry families back home. Others clenched jaws in anger, believing it was all a trick. But by morning, the trays returned, the smell drifted again, and resistance dissolved into routine. Fear had been replaced not by safety, but by something harder, uncertainty. And that uncertainty set the stage for moments no one expected, small flashes of redemption when hardened men began to see their enemy differently. December 1944. Snow dusted the barracks roofs, and frost clung to the barbed wire. For the German prisoners, Christmas had always been a sacred time, even at the front. Now, in captivity thousands of miles from home, the ache of separation grew sharper. Yet on that icy morning, something happened that none of them had imagined. The guards organized a holiday meal. Inside the camp mess hall, tables were lined with tin mugs of coffee, baskets of fresh donuts, and, most shocking of all, extra rations of chocolate. Prisoners shuffled in silently, expecting routine. Instead, they found warmth, smell, and a strange kind of festivity. American guards, some wearing Santa hats cut from red cloth, joked as they poured milk. One POW muttered under his breath, "This is madness. They make us celebrate." Reports confirm that in December 1944, holiday parcels were doubled for POW camps. Red Cross deliveries included candies, fruit, and cigarettes. To German eyes, this was surreal. At the same time, letters from home described families freezing in darkened apartments, carving turnips into ornaments. The contrast was unbearable. NNBUT, amid the confusion, something shifted. A senior German officer, known for his rigid posture and hard loyalty to the Reich, sat down with his men. When the guard slid a donut onto his tray, he hesitated. Slowly, he broke it in half and passed the piece to a younger prisoner beside him. "Eat," he said. It was not command, but kindness. For the first time, the officer allowed himself a faint smile. In that moment, the food became more than sustenance. It was a bridge. The officer's act symbolized a surrender not of arms, but of suspicion. He had seen cruelty in war, and now he saw something disarming, the enemy offering sweetness in the middle of December. Later, he confided quietly to his bunkmate, "In this moment, the war already felt lost, not because of defeat in battle, but because the contrast was too sharp. An enemy capable of kindness, backed by abundance, was an enemy that could not be undone." NNTHAT Christmas. Laughter echoed faintly in the barracks. For many, it was the first time captivity felt human, and from that humanity would grow something unexpected, the beginnings of friendship, born through food. The Christmas spirit lingered long after the decorations came down. By early 1945, the donut had stopped being a shock and started becoming a ritual. Every delivery, every shared tray, slowly chipped away at the wall between guard and prisoner. It wasn't open camaraderie. Wire and rifles still divided them, but something subtle grew in the spaces between bites. On cold mornings, guards would slide extra donuts toward the youngest or skinniest POWs. Sometimes they did it with a wink, sometimes without a word. One German boy, barely 19, captured in Normandy, later wrote, "I had not felt full since my mother's table. That day, I tasted mercy." Food became the medium of trust. Guards discovered that a donut or a cigarette handed across with casual ease dissolved tension faster than threats. Prisoners began answering questions more openly, working more diligently in camp labor details, and even volunteering to help clean kitchens. The sugary circles turned into silent tokens of cooperation, and NTHE statistics underline the effect. By the end of the war, over 90% of German POWs repatriated from the United States were healthier than at capture, according to Red Cross evaluations. Weight gain, stronger stamina, and better morale were documented across camps. In comparison, POWs held in Germany or the East had endured starvation and disease. NNTO many Germans, the generosity was baffling. They treated us like men, not animals, one recalled decades later. The donut became shorthand for dignity, the smallest proof that the enemy saw them not as expendable enemies, but as human beings. It was not universal. Some prisoners resisted, clinging to ideology, sneering at kindness as weakness. But others could not deny the human warmth behind the routine. They noticed how guards joked with them about weather, or even tried broken German phrases when passing out food. These moments carried no speeches, no propaganda leaflets. They carried only sweetness and shared humanity. In the evenings, after roll call, POWs often talked quietly in the barracks. Some admitted that the donuts had changed how they viewed America. One man said softly, "The guns defeated us, but the food disarmed us." That line captured the transformation. An enemy undone not by brutality, but by abundance wrapped in sugar. Yet beneath the friendships and softened hearts, a darker realization brewed. If America could afford this much for prisoners, what did it mean for the war still raging overseas? By spring 1945, the donuts had become more than daily bread. They were proof of something far heavier. Around barracks tables, whispers spread among the prisoners. If America can give this to us, what are they giving their armies? That question gnawed at morale harder than barbed wire ever could. Every convoy of supplies arriving at camp hammered the point home. Trucks unloaded flour by the ton, cans of sugar syrup, crates of coffee. All while back in Germany, factories lay in rubble, and families bartered turnips for soap. The imbalance was staggering. Prisoners counted the sacks, muttering that this single week's delivery could have fed an entire battalion at the front. NNTHE numbers were merciless. U.S. agriculture and industry produced 3 times more food than Axis Europe by 1944. German civilians scraped by on rations that barely sustained life, while captured soldiers in America sat down to meals with donuts, milk, and cigarettes. It wasn't propaganda, it was mathematics. And mathematics, unlike ideology, didn't bend. NNPOWs began to admit what few dared to say aloud. The war was already lost long before their capture. One diary scrawled in pencil put it bluntly, "If they waste sugar on us, how can we win?" That single line reflected a collapse not of discipline, but of faith, and even the most loyal officers could feel the cracks. Some tried to stiffen their men, warning them not to be fooled by enemy tricks, but the donuts undercut those words every morning. The evidence was edible, warm, and undeniable. America's industrial flood was not a rumor, it was breakfast. NNTHE confusion turned into resignation. In roll calls, men stood straighter, not out of defiance, but because they were fed. During work details, prisoners cooperated more easily, recognizing that resistance seemed pointless against a nation that could outproduce hunger itself. NNTHE guards never needed to explain it. Their casual indifference, chewing the same pastries, laughing about home, handing out cigarettes without thought, drove home the message more powerfully than any leaflet. The war had already been decided by factories and fields. NNTHE realization didn't just feed bodies, it reshaped minds. Captivity became a mirror of defeat, with every bite of sugar reflecting the imbalance of the wider world. And as the war drew to its end, the prisoners carried that bittersweet awareness into their final days in American camps, where the last taste waiting for them was not iron or ash, but donuts. May 1945. News of Germany's surrender reached the camps like a distant thunderclap. Guards announced it without ceremony, and the barbed wire fences suddenly felt less like cages and more like reminders of a war already over. The German prisoners sat in stunned silence, some staring at the dirt, others gazing at the American flags rippling overhead. Their empire had fallen. What they carried with them in those final weeks was not the sound of bombs or the clash of tanks, but the taste of donuts. Oral histories decades later repeat the same details: warm pastries, steaming coffee, cigarettes tucked into shirt pockets. For many, that memory outlasted fear, outlasted bitterness. A captured sergeant later told his children, "My first taste of America was sugar." NNTHE numbers underline the scale. Red Cross accounts mention millions of donuts, parcels, and small comforts spread across POW camps during the war. At least 7 million donuts alone had been served, a figure so absurd it became legendary among former captives. In interviews from the 1970s and 1980s, ex-POWs laughed softly when asked what they remembered most: not barbed wire, not punishment, but sweetness. And the irony was sharp. Men who had fought under a regime promising dominance discovered their lasting image of defeat was kindness. It was not the Sherman tank, the P-51 Mustang, or even the B-17's Thunder that shattered their spirit most. It was the casual, effortless generosity of a nation that could afford to waste luxury on its enemies. Many returned to a broken homeland, only to tell stories of abundance in American camps. Children of former POWs recall hearing about coffee, chocolate, and pastries more vividly than battles. One man said in an interview, "That donut told me everything. Germany could not win. For some, it bred shame. For others, it seeded admiration. But for all, it remained unforgettable." The sweetness of captivity became the lens through which they measured both the cruelty of their own regime and the surreal comfort of their former enemies. And so, in the shadows of war's end, the final surrender was not signed on paper or sealed with rifles stacked in rows. It was tasted. A surrender sweetened by donuts, still remembered in the quiet kitchens of history.